Welcome, everyone. Do you feel lonely? Have you ever felt lonely? Would you know that there is actually an epidemic of loneliness occurring across this country and arguably across at least the Western world? And today on Reflecting on Truth, we're going to talk a little bit about loneliness. And so before I get into that, I want to thank the folks who have allowed me to film in their studio. You can tell I'm not sitting outside and things look a little bit different from my previous videos. I want to thank the good people at Genesis Apologetics. A dear friend of mine, Dan, started Genesis Apologetics out of a deep commitment to bringing the truth of the Christian narrative, the Christian interpretation of the book of Genesis, and to bring a scientific rigor and historical focus to really bring the truths of the book of Genesis to life. And they have kindly provided me with the opportunity to record from their studio, as you can tell. And so I just want to say thank you to them as we begin this video. And also, I will put some links in the description for this video. And I'd encourage you to visit their website, and I'll have some links to some of their really important resources that they also have posted on YouTube. They're some of the best that I've seen. So, back to our presentation. Back in 1986, there was a movie that came out in theaters, and the movie was titled Crocodile Dundee. Perhaps you remember it. In the story, our hero, if we can call him a hero, his name was Nick Dundee, and he lived in a town called Walkabout Creek, Australia. Now, Walkabout Creek was a tight-knit community. People ate together, drank together, fought with each other, laughed with each other, and in a very real way, they loved each other in community. And so, as you can imagine, in the movie, he was invited to come to New York City with a reporter who had come out to do a story on him. And he came to New York City, and as he landed and he saw this vast number of people like he had never seen before, and he made this quote which stuck with me all these years. As he's in a cab, he says, "Imagine 7 million people all wanting to live together. New York must be the friendliest place in the world." Now, we laugh at this, and it's funny because we know how untrue it is in the world where we live. And yet, it's such an insightful point to make because of the fact that somehow we all know that it should be true. Something is missing in our culture. And that something is a sense of community, a deep connection. And so as Nick interacted with people in the community, he always tended to assume the best from just about everyone, even the, quote, bad people. There's a scene where a teenager comes up to Nick and his the reporter who is taking him around town, and this teenager and a couple other teenagers come up and they pull a knife and they say, "Give me your wallet." And the reporter tells Nick, "Nick, give him your wallet." And he's like, "Why?" And she said, "Because he's got a knife." And Nick, he reaches down into his boot and he pulls out this giant knife and he says, "That's not a knife. This is a knife." And he kind of cuts up the teenager's coat and they all run away. And Nick's attitude toward that is, these are just some teenagers having fun. So Nick had this perspective on people that is juxtaposed against how you and I have grown up to see what culture and community is like for us. So in the real world, the fact is there is a vast swath of humanity that's hurting. They're suffering from many things. Some of these things are physical. I have friends, you probably have friends who are enduring some terrible physical things as I talk. But a lot of these hurts, these injuries that people are walking around with, you might call them the walking wounded, a lot of these injuries are emotional in nature. Now, it's been clearly borne out in research, as well as personal experience, that one of the most significant problems today, at least in the United States, is the fact that most of us suffer from moderate to intense loneliness. Why do you think that is? In the midst of the greatest standard of living the world has ever known, how is it possible, in the midst of so much abundance, many of us feel such a deep longing, a hollowness in our hearts, an emptiness? How is that possible? Well, in today's talk, I want to explore this topic from a research perspective, a scriptural perspective, and a spiritual perspective. And I'm going to do this in 3 parts. The first video, we're going to talk about data, because it's always a good idea to start with what's the situation on the ground? What are people currently experiencing? So I'm going to be talking about a lot of data in this presentation. Now, in the second presentation, I want to talk about the possible explanation for this phenomena of emotional hurt, particularly loneliness, as it's found in the Bible. And then the third presentation, I'm going to discuss what I believe are some solutions that are offered to us that can help us to survive in a culture that is sick. It's sick in so many ways, and one of those ways is due to a disconnection and loneliness that people feel between each other. So first, let's dive into the data. And like I say, there's going to be a fair amount of data that we're going to talk about. So stick with me on this. I know some people, data, their eyes kind of glaze over a little bit, but in this case, it's really important that we understand this for many reasons, not only for ourselves, but for us to have an accurate understanding of what people are experiencing around us. Because when we understand that, then we can, take steps to maybe make life a little bit better for some people. So loneliness, first off, it's important to realize, what is loneliness? Loneliness is far more than just a bad feeling. We all have experiences that are brief in nature where we may feel bored or alone or lonely. But we're talking serious loneliness. It harms people both individually, and it injures the health of our society at large. Loneliness, believe it or not, is associated with a greater risk of disease, such as cardiovascular disease, stroke, depression, anxiety, and even premature death. Can you imagine? You can die of loneliness. The mortality impact of being socially disconnected is similar to that caused by smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. Believe it's true, and I'm going to back that up in just a minute. And even greater, it's a greater risk than that associated with obesity and physical inactivity. And the harmful consequences of loneliness in a society can be felt in our schools, it's felt in our workplaces, our civic organizations, and where performance, productivity, and engagement, they're all diminished because of loneliness. So what are the risks associated with loneliness? Well, first, it increases the risk of premature death by 26 to 29%. And it's lacking social connection can increase the risk for premature death, like I said earlier, by as much as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And poor or insufficient social connection is associated with increased risk of diseases, including a 29% increased risk in heart disease and a 32% increased risk in stroke. Now, isn't that dramatic? I mean, would you expect that something that we would consider just a simple emotional feeling could have that kind of effect on your life. It truly is remarkable. Furthermore, loneliness is associated with an increased risk in several other emotional and mental illnesses, such as anxiety, depression, and even dementia. And the lack of social connection can increase the susceptibility to viruses. It impacts your immune system and makes you susceptible to a whole host of other things. Now, you might wonder, where am I getting this information? This information was obtained from the 2023 Surgeon General's report. The Surgeon General of the United States wrote a report which he called the loneliness epidemic. And so I'd encourage you to look that up, the 2023 Surgeon General's report on loneliness or loneliness epidemic, and you'll find the report and various summaries of it. And in that report, we find that half of US adults are experiencing some of the highest rates of loneliness in the world. And what's more is they're experiencing significant loneliness as a group, the whole United States population, but the highest rates of loneliness occur among young adults. Now that is surprising to me, because when I was a young adult, I didn't experience that much loneliness. And the people of my age group, when I talked to them, they didn't either. I mean, there's some, everybody feels lonely a little bit, but in our current culture, we're experiencing a significant disconnect where young people who are at that point in their life when they really shouldn't have to be worrying about so many things are being crushed under a weight of loneliness. And that's a tragedy. Now, loneliness and isolation are more widespread than many of the other health issues in our day. Believe it or not, it's more prevalent than smoking, diabetes, obesity, and they have comparable levels of risk and premature death as those physical illnesses are caused by loneliness. I mean, isn't that a surprising statistic to consider? But here's something that I found fascinating from the Surgeon General's report, is that despite such high prevalence of loneliness, less than 20% of individuals who are experiencing this loneliness, either always or most of the time, they don't recognize it as a major problem. They don't see it as the problem it is. It's causing all these problems for their physical health, for their performance on the job and their performance in school, and yet they don't recognize that this disconnection that they're experiencing is a driver of that. Now, one of the ways to measure social connection is looking at how people trust one another. Now, if you go back to 1970 or 1972, polls were conducted and they showed that about 45% of Americans felt like they could trust other Americans. So about half the population felt fairly trusting toward their fellow Americans. That proportion shrank from 42% or 45% to 30% in 2016. What do you think it is now? I don't have a statistic for that, but just based on anecdotal information or information that you receive from looking around at the culture, wouldn't you believe it's a lot lower than that? With our political divisions and our ideological divisions and families even separating over differences in their politics, I would imagine that the amount of trust people are experiencing toward each other is at an all-time low. And it's just encouraged by the ongoing onslaught of the 24-hour news cycle. We're just bombarded daily with reasons to be afraid and to fear, and fear affects trust. And at the same time this is happening, there's this other phenomenon that's occurring. There's this decrease in social participation across several kinds of important relationships. These have steadily declined. And I'll give you some examples. The amount of time people engaged with their friends, socially, in person, like getting together face to face, decreased from 60 minutes a day or 30 hours a month in 2003 to 20 minutes a day or 10 hours a month in 2020. That's a decline of 66% in the amount of time people are getting together face to face to engage in social connection. And this represents a decrease of 20 hours per month spent engaging with friends. Now, the decline is starkest among people ages 15 to 24. For this age group, remember I said earlier that the experience of loneliness is substantially greater for young adults. Listen to this. For those people who are 15 to 24 years old, this age group, in terms of time spent in person with friends, has declined by nearly 70% over the last 20 years, from roughly 150 minutes per day in 2003 to 40 minutes per day in 2020. Consider that. Now, again, I'm going to talk about, I'm obviously a little bit older here, but when I was young, you lived for times with your friends. My greatest memories are with the things that I did socially with my friends. And yet, in spite of the image that's presented in the media and on TV with, young and beautiful and happy youth out there doing all these things, the statistics do not lie. They're not doing that. Everybody is watching a presentation of life that doesn't exist. For the vast majority of people, they're barely spending any time with their friends at all. Did you know that in 1960, single-person households accounted for just 13% of the US population? In 2022, that number more than doubled to 29%. Now, there was a book that I read. It's dated. It's a little bit dated. It's from the early 2000s, and it was written by a man named Robert Putnam. Now, this book was called Bowling Alone. And so Robert Putnam, social scientist, he did a study of how things have changed in our culture in terms of our social landscape. So if you were to go back into the 50s and in the 60s, the fabric of the culture of the United States was filled with civic engagement. Children were in 4-H or FFA, which used to be called Future Farmers of America, but now it's just rebranded FFA. People attended things like bridge clubs and social clubs. Church attendance was high. So there's this milieu going on in the culture where people are connecting with one another. That has been declining drastically ever since. Membership in organizations that have been important pillars of community connection have declined significantly. And one of these areas where this decline in what you might call civic engagement or social connection has been a decline that has occurred in participation in faith-based organizations like churches and things like that. In 2020, not all that long ago, of course, 47% of Americans said they belonged to a church, synagogue, or mosque. 47%. This is down from 70% just 21 years earlier in 1999. And it represents a dip below 50% for the first time in the history of the survey question. Now, right there, I could stop and go off on a tangent. There's a lot we could say about why that's happening. And perhaps in a future video, I want to talk a lot more in depth about the implications of that decline in participation in faith-based organizations. But it's a significant problem because traditionally, there are a whole host of advantages that come from attending churches. And some of these you have connections when things go wrong, right? You have someone you can call when you get in trouble, because the nature of traditional church connections is more like a family, as it was designed to be, than it is about just being a part of an organization. There's a deeper connection that comes when people believe they're part of what we would call the family of God. But this participation has dropped below 50%. And this was in 2020. It's dropped even more since then. And so, as a consequence of this decline in participation, individuals' health can also be undermined in different ways. Now, I want to talk about the demographics of social isolation and loneliness. The highest rates of social isolation, as I mentioned, or no, I haven't mentioned this yet, are found in older adults. Now, I want to draw a distinction here between social isolation and loneliness. Now, all of us are different in the amount of social connection that we feel we need. And so social isolation just means you're not around people. Loneliness doesn't necessarily require social isolation. And I'll talk about that, I think, in a couple of minutes. But so isolation is reported fairly frequently among older adults. It gets harder to make friends as you get older, especially if you're not attending social organizations, right? But although older adults have a higher propensity of social isolation, young adults are twice as likely to report feeling lonely as those who are over 65. Now, the rate of loneliness among young adults has increased every year between 1976 and 2019. Now, in addition, and this is where the economic side of things come into play, lower income adults are often reporting that they are more likely to be lonely than those with higher incomes. Now, some of that makes a lot of sense, right? There are people who have to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And if they have children, they're having to work twice as hard. And so they don't have the time, they don't have the disposable time to get out there and socialize. And so they experience more loneliness than people who have higher incomes. 63% of adults who earn less than $50,000 per year are considered lonely, which is 10 percentage points higher than those who earn more than $50,000 a year. And it's not just the US. I mean, my little microcosm where I live in California is different from the rest of the United States, and the US is somewhat different from other countries. But in a study that was conducted in Britain on British youth, they found almost 50% of British young people, 16 to 25, expressed significant loneliness. They were lonelier than any other group. Now, what's concerning about this is the fact that research tends to show that there are consequences to loneliness, right? There's medical consequences, psychological consequences. And so some of these, the emotional fallout includes depression and increased risk of suicide. Because when you're down, when you're lonely, and you don't have someone you can connect with, it feels like you're down in a pit and you can't get out. It leads to poor sleep and the consequences of sleep deprivation, which are wide. Cognitive impairment, inattention, emotional blunting, decreased productivity. I mean, it affects the economy, it affects the person, it affects everything. It also leads to an inability to self-regulate. One of my favorite preachers that I like to listen to, who sadly he's passed now, is Charles Stanley. And Charles Stanley talked about the times when you are most susceptible to temptations are when you're hungry, angry, lonely, or sad, right? Because you're wrapped in on yourself. And so as a result, it can cause all kinds of problems. You can make poor decisions. You lose the ability to self-regulate. You might overeat. You drink excessively, smoke, or drug misuse behaviors. And all of these are meant to soothe this feeling that you just have to get out from under. And all of these have further medical consequences, such as obesity, high cholesterol, known consequences of tobacco use and drug use, high blood pressure, cancer risk, and addiction. Loneliness is terrible. And it just is, it affects your immune system. And so loneliness is associated with depression. There's an association between loneliness and depressive symptoms. I looked at the statistics for this, and I know most people would not be interested in the specific, like how much you can predict an increase in loneliness when you're depressed, but you can actually make a prediction about a person's depression based on an increase in the loneliness that they feel. So we're drawing to the conclusion of part one in this presentation on how to survive loneliness. So there it is. The hard data indicate that many of us are at this very moment experiencing loneliness. Are you experiencing loneliness? Do you have people that you know that when you need to reach out, night or day, you can connect with? Do you have the social support that you need? Does this loneliness, if you have it, is it affecting your life? Or if you know someone who's lonely and you can't quite figure out why, is it affecting your relationships? So we know it's a significant problem, but the thing about all this data that I've shared with you is that it fails to convey the real pain that those of us who have experienced significant loneliness suffer from on a day in, day out basis. The data fails to tell the story of the sadness and woe that is experienced throughout our culture. And here's the surprising thing, even when we're surrounded with people. Have you ever been in a room full of people and yet felt utterly alone? That's kind of like what we experienced when we talked about the Crocodile Dundee example. It simply didn't occur to the character in the movie that so many people could be together and yet be all alone. And yet that's the reality of it. Many of us can be at work, and we can be at church, we can go to a party, we can be out in a crowd, and yet as the world moves around us, you're all on your own. So are you one of the 150 million Americans today whose lives are being impacted with moderate to significant loneliness? I'm hoping that what I'm about to share with you in part two of our presentation will help you to understand where this is coming from. That'll be in our next session. I hope you'll join me. And so thank you for joining me today for this initial discussion on the data and research behind loneliness in America. I'm Jim Higgins, and this is Reflecting on Truth.